Hello and welcome to AviaDev Insight Africa, the podcast offering a window to your world of African aviation with your host, Jon Howell, CEO and founder of AviaDev Africa. Today's guest is very special because it is somebody that I've known for over a decade, a leader who continues to be a beacon of hope for African aviation. The guest in question is Adefunke Adeyemi, who is the Secretary General of the African Civil Aviation Commission, AFCAC, and has dedicated much of her professional life to improving the operating environment for our continent's airlines, airports, and regulators. She is also the recipient of the Ato Girma Lifetime Achievement Award for an outstanding contribution to route development. This was awarded back in 2021 at AviaDev, and actually were rewarding her former efforts whilst at IATA. So we knew, and we said at the time, this was not a Lifetime Achievement Award that was being given at the end of a career, but little did we know that at that point she was about to step into the top job at AFCAC. So the last time we were together in October 2023, I came and visited SG at AFCAC headquarters in Dakar during the ACI Africa event. So obviously it's a well overdue catch up, and I was referring back to that and listening back to that episode. If you do want to revisit that conversation, it's episode 265, so you can find it there on the back catalogue. Now, for those of you listening, and provide a little bit of context, AFCAC is, amongst other things, the executing agency of the Yamassoukro decision, the 1999 agreement designed to create a pan-African air transport market by liberalizing air services, removing restrictions on market access, capacity and frequency, and effectively domesticating the African skies, which of course was signed back in 2018 through SAATM as well, which was the renewed effort to get YD implemented. So back in Nairobi in 2023 during AviaDev, AFCAC and AviaDev signed an MOU, which built on a partnership that we've had for some time that is genuinely symbiotic. AFCAC's mandate, of course, through SAATM is to help build that favorable regulatory condition in which the airlines and the airports can operate, expand, and unlock new opportunities. Whereas AviaDev Africa is the platform where those opportunities become tangible, where carriers, airport operators, and stakeholders come together to turn potential routes into real ones. So, with that long intro, our aim today is to move beyond the broad statements and get into some of the specifics. We want to talk about implementation, enforcement, opportunities, and the current areas of focus for AFCAC. So, SG, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be back with you after a little bit of time has passed, and it's always a pleasure to engage and to discuss aviation matters in Africa with you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. And obviously, we'll be together this weekend at AFRA, so it's always great to see somebody in person. So let's kick off. You were re-elected as Secretary General of AFCAC 12 months ago. So this is obviously after our previous podcast. I can't believe it's been 12 months already. And as in any organization, in any association, continuity of leadership is really vital for progress in any industry. So I'd like you to start by sort of reflecting on your first term and the first 12 months of the second term. Was the experience that you actually had broadly aligned with what you set out to achieve, what you expected, what surprised you, and ultimately, what are you most proud of that you've achieved so far?
Okay, John. So first of all, the Secretary General role is 2 lots of 3 years each. So I've just finished my first term, even though I was appointed for the second term a year ago. So I started. Yeah, exactly. Just in month 2 of my second term. But John, when I came into office, I had a straightforward 3-year theory of change, if you like, in my mind. The first was to build, and then strengthen, and then consolidate. So year 1 for me was about foundations, looking at where we were at the time and where I met AFCAC at the time, building on what others before me had done, and to see how I could build further. So looking at how we could make a stronger institution, a stronger team, a stronger relationship with our member states, a stronger network of partners, and a stronger AFCAC brand that was visible and trusted when we speak on behalf of African aviation. And if I look back, the experience has aligned broadly with what I set out to do at the time, but it has also been quite intense and more interconnected and complex than I had originally anticipated. So let's talk about some of the different areas where we have made interventions and significant progress. As you know, AFCAC is the specialized agency of the African Union, just as a reminder. And so we cover all aspects of civil aviation on the African continent. And we are also the executing agency of the Yamassoukro decision, as you mentioned, meaning we are tasked by the AU, our heads of states and presidents, to proceed or to go forward with initiatives that will see to the implementation of the Yamassoukro decision, leading to the single African air transport market. So our 6 priority areas are: number 1, safety, of course. So safety is a critical element that we can never, ever take our eyes off, and that's our number 1 priority. And we have some continental initiatives that were designed to strengthen the safety culture and the safety performance of our member states, as well as the airlines that fly into them. And we had 2 specific initiatives on that. Number 1 was a cooperative scheme where we pulled technical support from states who had a lot of experience and capacity to support those states who did not, and to support them to build and improve on safety. The second initiative was to look at our infrastructure gaps across the continent on safety, which covers, of course, aerodromes, air navigation services, equipment, aircraft fleet, equipage, maintenance, and so on, and to see how we could begin to close those gaps through bankable projects and specific initiatives that address those issues. And the third area was to look at how the safety targets that were set specifically for Africa are being implemented, can be strengthened and monitored in terms of its implementation. So that's on safety. And specifically through those 2 initiatives, security as well, we had a pooling of experts on security who also offer technical assistance to states, as well as looking at how we could ensure that through security frameworks, we are providing seamless movement of people and goods and services across Africa. So on those 2, for example, we've seen Africa's average effective implementation score, which is the scoring mechanism under ICAO because they set the standards for safety and security. We've seen this climb, actually, and with both of them averaging 5 to 6% increase over the past 3 years. Many of our states have made double-digit improvements, and in fact, some of our states are doing much better than other regions of the world in the 90s in terms of these scores, some of our African states. So this is really, really significant. And through this AFCAC program, we ran 11 technical assistance missions to 6 states, including targeted support to the states with low effective implementation score. I should say actually that over the past 3 years, the total number of missions was 35 to 14 states, but in the past year alone, it was 11 missions to 6 states, okay? So we've been working, and this, we don't do it just as AFCAC alone, because aviation is a cooperative and collaborative industry. There is no one who can stand alone. And so working together with ICAO and with regional safety organizations and with experts from our African states, and even with support from partners like Boeing, like EASA, like the World Bank, and so on, we bring these technical missions to the states to make tangible impact in their safety and security culture. So this is one of the areas that we've really worked on, and we delivered roughly 80% of our planned activities. At the same time, we've been able to capacitate African professionals, and with more than 470 experts trained in cooperation with many of our partner states who support us on capacity building. So these were not abstract trainings. These are specific issues in terms of the priorities and needs of our African states in terms of capacitating African professionals. But they're also building blocks for safer operations on the continent. Over this past 3 years, I'm also proud of how we've started to close the infrastructure and capacity gap, like I mentioned. So through these infrastructure pipelines on aerodromes and cargo, air navigation, environment, aircraft equipage, and upgrading, we are now working on over 60 identified gaps, covering 41 countries in Africa, which represents almost 85% of that intra-African market. So it's a significant chunk. And if we can get this right in terms of addressing the critical infrastructure gaps, then it will flow across the entire continent, and this will benefit everyone. So we have built a pool of 30 plus experts on security specifically from 22 states to support these missions and represent Africa in global forums. We've moved from talking about emergency issues or emerging issues, such as the biometrics and digitization for facilitation of passengers like API PNR, one-stop security, cybersecurity, to actually running joint programs with partners such as IATA, such as AFCAC, such as ACAO, and even the TSA to help states implement them. Institutionally, the last term has been about putting AFCAC on a firmer footing. And all 8 African candidates at the ICAO Assembly were elected into the ICAO Council for the current triennium 2025 to 2028. This sends a strong signal of Africa's cohesion. We've also updated our seat agreement, the host agreement with Senegal, our host state, where AFCAC has been headquartered since 1969. And we saw more states ratify key international instruments such as the MC99, the Beijing Instruments, Montreal Protocol, and even the Cape Town Convention. But what has been really interesting and what surprised me most was how quickly good political decisions can translate into market movement when the technical and legal groundwork is ready. So conversely, I've also been reminded that one unresolved regulatory or cost-related issue can hold back an entire corridor. But what I'm most proud of is that today, AFCAC is seen and recognized less as a secretariat that is bureaucratic and slow, that writes communiques, and more as an efficient and effective organization that can help states resolve real problems, from closing safety gaps and security issues to addressing environmental challenges and opportunities, but also to seeing how we can develop air transport on the continent of Africa through practical measures, including opening new routes, harmonization of taxes and charges, and harmonizing, of course, the regulatory framework. And I'm also exceptionally proud of the AFCAC team that we have built together over the past 3 years, who have done amazing work to deliver these results to our member states.
Yeah, really, really nice start. And absolutely, in terms of being somebody who's practical and willing to come on a platform like this, I mean, that's not just saying it, you're actually doing it. You know, you've said, I'm willing to engage here. And I think the points that you made about safety, security, capacity development, all super important, that we don't take for granted, and all the foundations and the building blocks for us to be able to then open a market. It needs to be safe. It needs to be secure. It needs to have the right people with the right skills. So all of that work doesn't stop in the background. But I think what I want to do is really focus in on what's happened when it comes to SAATM. I was there in 2018 when SAATM was signed. I was not in Yamassoukro in 1999, but you know, it is something that has been around a long time, and there are many declarations of support for SAATM, but there is a perception, which I'm sure you're well aware of within the industry itself, that implementation on the ground is limited. How do you address the skeptics and those who say it'll never work, it's not working? And can you point to some tangible evidence that shows that it is genuinely advancing in Africa, and that the success has been a trickle-down effect of policy decisions made at government level?
Okay, great. So first of all, let's remind ourselves of what the Yamassoukro decision is. It is the framework agreement for the liberalization of intra-African air transport, meaning how Africa connects with itself better by air. All right, so this is the purpose of the YD. And we believe that the YD remains relevant even today. Why? Because the provisions of the YD speak to the gradual liberalization of frequency, pricing, market access, designation of airlines, as well as the regulatory framework. And all of these are designed to ensure that we have a sustainable air transport market in Africa, founded and based on cooperation between airlines and airports and states, and all of these other stakeholders that need to ensure that we can have this interconnected market. And again, as I mentioned, this framework agreement of YD is a pathway towards achieving a single African air transport market. So the market cannot function without the foundation or the regulatory framework of the YD and its annexes. And those annexes speak to how the market is, the rules of engagement of the market are regulated, so the competition rules and the fairness and so on. It also speaks to how consumers are treated, but more importantly, it speaks to how disputes are resolved or regulated. Okay. And so this is important. And for many years, I used to hear that, oh, the YD is not working or cannot work because all of the elements are not in place. Well, now they are. And what we've also seen is that even without the elements being in place, many of our states and airlines have been taking advantage of the opportunity that the YD brings towards a single African air transport market. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail.
Yeah,
but
sure.
I think it's important to mention that as just the foundational statements. The second issue is that, yes, people have been saying, oh, the YD is not working and, there's supposed to be full liberalization. Well, how is that going to happen? Even in families, nobody speaks the same way. This is not Stepford Wives after all. So it's not going to happen with 55 states at the same pace at the same time. It's not. And even with Europe, that everyone uses as a benchmark today in terms of their own liberalization journey, it took several years and it took several packages. So it is not going to happen. Yes, it's true. People say it's 35 years since the declaration, now 36, and 26 years since the decision. But yeah, things have happened in that time. And I keep saying that SAATM and YD implementation, they are not a big bang. It's not going to happen like we sleep over and overnight, we're going to wake up and all of Africa is going to be interconnected. It's going to happen step by step with all of the elements being in place, being enforced, being monitored for implementation, and being promoted. So people need to know about what the opportunities are. Now, to the skeptics about YD and SAATM, my message is simple. The era of purely declaratory liberalization is over. Also, the era of making political statements about YD without implementation from AFCAC as the executing agency or from the other states is also over. And we have results to prove this. So under our leadership and our work in this area and the political backing of the African Union, the SAATM is now visibly reshaping the African market by air, okay, the intra-African market. Intra-African connectivity has risen to 23% from 14.5%, which was the baseline, if you recall, when we did this analysis in 2021. At the time, I was in IATA and I was part of that study, and that was the benchmark or baseline. So we've seen an almost 10% increase in the market over that time. And this is a combination of direct routes and fifth freedom routes. So we're seeing that shift, not just in the policy and the statements, but in actual airline schedules and passenger journeys. And over this period, in this period of time, we've seen that over last week, 113 new routes in 3 years. 113 new routes. And there is evidence to this. We have a list of all of those routes. And I know, John, in your podcast, you like to say, okay, what are the specifics? Which routes have opened? Well, unfortunately, I cannot reel out all 113 routes over here. But
we had one yesterday. We had one, Tanzania have announced Cape Town via Victoria Falls, right? There you go.
That's now 114. Thank you very much for adding that for us. So basically, if we are looking, and what we've been doing is looking and tracking and monitoring the activities across the market. And we are being a bit obtuse to the noise and just focusing on what are the realities on the ground, what is actually happening in intra-Africa, in traffic across the market. Now, I also like I like this analogy that the intra-African market is like a child. When a child is born, it's tiny. it's a little thing. And then it starts to grow, and then it becomes a toddler. And then they get to that point where they have a growth spurt. And that is what is going to happen with the intra-African market. I see it, I know it, and I believe it. And this is the way that markets grow, because it does not happen overnight. Yes, it is true that the implementation of the market at the moment, or the rules of the market, are a bit uneven, but that is part of the job. It is to engage with the different stakeholders and to sensitize them about why it is important for us to have a consistent approach to the implementation of these issues. And of course, we have those challenges that have beset the market and the SAATM and YD for so many years. Those have not gone away, but in some cases, they have, and they're gradually reducing. That is part of the work. It's not going to happen overnight, and it probably won't even complete before I leave office in AFCAC. But the point is to build those foundations so that, over time, the consistency of that market begins to be enhanced.
Yeah, it's a big dream.
Yeah, exactly. Now we have the routes. These routes, they have already carried more than 3 million passengers. And I think actually that number is much more, but this is just based on the data that we have access to, or that we've been given access to. And it has supported roughly about 8,200 additional jobs across airlines, airports, the tourism sector, and logistics. So we're tracking all of this, and we're looking at the information on what the impact of these new routes have done, and basically has enabled an estimated $2.8 billion of additional trade value each year in this past 3 years through faster transit times and better cargo lanes. And that is what SAATM looks like when it starts to live. And this is the reality on the ground that we have. Now, behind these numbers, there is deliberate work. We have updated the Continental Study on the socioeconomic benefits of SAATM that I mentioned earlier, and we are going to be rolling that out come January 2020, using all of the data that we're getting as we engage to communicate the scale of the opportunity to our high-level decision makers, from presidents to ministers, not just of aviation or transport, but also of finance, trade, tourism, interior, and planning, so that they really understand the value that this brings. We've also developed model templates for air service agreement compliance that are aligned with the YD. And we have also developed one on economic regulation, so that states are not left alone to design complex competition, economic competition, or consumer protection regimes. We've also carried out studies on air cargo liberalization. Actually, one is underway. And also on the impact of high taxes and fees. This is a very important one that we completed last month, and we're going to be rolling out the recommendations from that study. And also on competition issues. We've started to see this translate into concrete policy decisions and action. One example is in the ECOWAS bloc, where the heads of state of the ECOWAS countries agreed in December 2024 that there would be a 25% reduction in aviation taxes and charges directly applied on the tickets, which has been approved and is going to take effect from January 2026. We're involved in that work, and we're going to be monitoring progress on it. Globally, there's been independent analysis that supports what we are saying. Our updated Continental Study scales that logic across the wider SAATM membership, right? And aligns it with the ambitions of the African Continental Free Trade Area, particularly for high value, time sensitive trade, which can move by air. And so the answer to your question after all of this is that SAATM is no longer a theoretical construct. It is expanding route networks, growing traffic, and starting to reduce travel times. And I have to give you a practical example, John. So I think I've talked about this before. We're going to Angola. The only option that we had before a year ago was to go travel a day and a half to go there and a day and a half to come back. Now it is a 10-hour journey. That is one of the practical examples. And the reason why we keep talking about why the fifth freedom under our SAATM is so important is because it allows the airlines to develop routes in the short term. And then once those routes have robust enough, they can drop off for more direct service, because ultimately everybody wants to fly direct, right? We don't want to hop around. But because of our size, our scale, and the fact that those routes are so thin, especially to start off with, we need the fifth freedom. And so we continue to promote this, and it is really important. Also, we need to see the fares coming down so that the policy and cost environment are aligned. And for African airlines, we need them to cooperate more, because a fully implemented SAATM is not, it's not a luxury. It shouldn't be seen as that. It's an opportunity for the airlines. And it is the only realistic platform on which the airlines in Africa can become Pan-African and Pan-African champions, rather than being confined to these fragmented high-cost niches that the airlines in Africa are in. So the question is no longer whether liberalization works, but how quickly and how consistently we're seeing its application, and we are prepared to implement it.
Yeah, brilliant. I totally agree with you on fifth freedom. And I think alongside that is cooperation, right? Is working with other partners and other airlines to provide that feed too. So we'll come back to that shortly. I think that, we've followed this for years because it was obviously the IATA study on the liberalization benefit. And that showed the scale of opportunity. And I remember it showing that every single country would be a net beneficiary in terms of its income, and to different levels, but it was going to be a benefit by implementing open skies. And of course, now you can actually say there are these results. I love that you're keeping track of all of the routes, because, that is just so important. And as we said before, it's a big dream, but it's about working towards that and showing that tangible success, and working with a coalition of the willing. We always talked about this too, that if countries say we're not ready or we're not prepared, you say, okay, you come and see us when there is enough results that you suddenly want to get on board that train. There's no point me telling you that you have to do something if you don't want to. So I think, like, a straightforward question off the back of this is, how many countries today would be classified as SAATM operational? So not that they've signed something, but they're fully removed restrictions in line with the decision, that you're happy that they are, implementing all of those things. And if there is disputes, if there is competition issues, that they will listen to you, that you will mediate. Where are we at with that? Because we've heard of signing, then implementation, and there's been a lot of sort of slow progress from that perspective.
Well, thank you. So it's a fundamental question, actually, but also a nuanced one, right? So we need to distinguish between the states that have signed, which is the 38 number, and then the states that have actually removed the restrictions or are implementing. And there are quite a number within our groups. So let's break it down. Today, we have 26 states who are part of the SAATM pilot implementation project. Last year, they were lower than that. I think we had 21. Okay, so now today we're 26, already showing that more states are joining. If you remember, when we started in November 2022, we had 13 states. From that number, we grew to, I think, 17, and then it grew to 21, and now we're at 26.
And you were clustering them as well, weren't you?
Correct,
they were into
exactly.
Smaller clusters.
And the cluster approach is still working, but it's also been dynamic. It's also been fluid. So originally we came up with these kinds of clusters, but as we've been engaging more and more, we've seen different other clusters that could also be as effective, if not more. So for example, within this group of 26, we have a group of 7 called the Banjul Accord group of countries. And these are countries in West Africa that already have a multilateral air service agreement between them. And what we're asking them to do is just take the next step, which is to domesticate their market between themselves. And domestication of a market means that that market is not considered an international market, all right? And which is the whole point of the YD and the SAATM. So we also have another group of countries in East Africa, which, is basically they call the Eastern Corridor, a group of 4. And those states already have a lot of aligned regulations. And so we're trying to engage and see how we can facilitate that domestication as well. We have another group in Southern Africa, a group of 5 called the CASA group, and to see how we can support that. But more importantly also is to see how we can cross between regions, from one region to another, because that's really the key, isn't it? It's about making sure that aviation traverses the continent and is not just limited within regions. So let's give examples. In Southern Africa, there's immense connectivity. In North Africa, there's immense connectivity. In East Africa, there's immense connectivity. West and Central, not so much, but growing and improving more and more as we're seeing more routes being opened, particularly on a Fifth Freedom basis. But what we'd like is to have more of that so that, it makes it easy to travel across the continent. So these states, there are different and various levels of implementation or compliance with the YD and with the regulations. In some states, there are a handful of them that they have absolutely no restrictions whatsoever, and they have opened up completely. And we have, a few examples that, I can just reel off over the top of my head. We have Rwanda, we have, I think it's Zimbabwe, we have Zambia, we have quite a number of the states across who have said we are open for business and we are committing to abiding by these rules. We also have a number of countries that are on that journey and looking at addressing some of the previous restrictions or limitations towards implementation, and we're working with the states. So in fact, what we're doing is not just the advocacy, not just the engagements in terms of different coalitions and meeting different stakeholders, but we're also conducting audits. So we've developed a framework of audits based on the YD and its regulations, and looking and going into states to say, okay, where are you on all of these elements? And we've done 10 so far out of our group of 20, whatever it is, because we go physically into those states. And we've identified specific gaps, either in air service agreements, which they're supposed to be aligned with the YD, all right? And so we show them the templates and say, this is what you're supposed to align your air service agreement with, or either in licensing practices, either in the competition or consumer protection frameworks, or in how they apply the Fifth Freedom and capacity rules to day-to-day decisions. So of these states, those out of the 10, 6 have now closed all of these identified gaps and can reasonably be described as SAATM operational in the complete sense of the word. And their regulatory frameworks and actual market behavior are, are fully aligned with the YD and with SAATM. However, as I mentioned, and being honest about this, we still have a moving, picture. It's not a static, like, okay, this is it and it's fixed forevermore. No, it is a moving picture, not a static scoreboard. So several of these states are preparing to undergo the same rigor, the same structured audit process. And in 2026, we're going to be undergoing quite a number of them. I hope we're able to reach another 10 to systematically identify and close those gaps. And the objective over this term, and the second term and last term, is not just to grow the number of signatories, of course, but that has never been the focus, but to significantly increase the number of states that meet that higher bar of being truly SAATM operational in practice based on this clear criteria that we have through the audits, and to make that status visible to the industry.
Yeah, I think that's really great. I think that what people from the outside, the people in the industry that speak to me, and what I think would work really well is a visual representation of this. One idea is a public scorecard kind of thing, saying here are the countries, these are fully compliant, these are partially compliant, these are non-compliant, and whether you'd be comfortable to share that, but also showing the progress. I mean, you said it's a moving picture. So you say, this is what it looked like a year ago. This is what it looks like now. You can see that more states are moving. And of course, if your state, not picking one out, but if your state is red here and is not operational, you need to go and lobby. You need to help us get this moving and understand why. And some of that will be very open and overt as to why they're not doing it. And some countries and governments have been very open and honest and said, we're not ready. We need to protect. We need to keep our borders closed, etc. And I have respect for that, because but it's one thing to say it and then not implement. But as you said, the success is definitely coming. So would you consider an idea like a visual scorecard?
Yes, absolutely, John. And it's just 1 year late in coming. That was the plan for 2025.
Okay.
But actually, it's perfect timing because this is 3 years have gone by. And I think 3 years is actually a really good period of time to be able to consolidate whatever progress has been made and then be able to put that together in some kind of communication. So that is actually part of our plan, a clear communication roadmap, as well as a scorecard to show where we are in terms of SAATM implementation. If you recall, the continental study that was done assessed all of the states in Africa in terms of their level of adherence or compliance with the YD and so on. And we're going to be doing something similar with that and having this scorecard. So we have a communications resource that is onboarded in AFCAC since this year, and we're about to begin the work. So watch this space. AFCAC communications are about to change, and what you've been seeing all along improved is going to get even better. Absolutely. Visibility is essential. We agree with that because transparent. If people don't know what you're doing, even if you're doing all of the work, then it probably won't matter. Also, we know that we can't ask some of the stakeholders like airlines to plan long-term investments into fleets and networks if they do not know where and when markets are really going to be open. So we've already taken 2 essential steps here. First, our SAATM implementation audits that I mentioned, they're not meant to sit in a shelf. We have a transparent methodology that is built around the YD itself and its regulatory text. So again, back to what I said, the YD remains relevant. So all those provisions in the YD, we've built this audit around it. And as we finalize each audit, we prepare a summary highlighting where that state is compliant, partially compliant, or non-compliant, and the remedial actions that need to be taken. So those findings feed into our statutory reporting to the African Union, inform AFCAC's advocacy with our ministers and regulators, and are shared with industry as appropriate. Secondly, we have strengthened our communication platforms, as I mentioned. We've already, just to highlight, that we have an AFCAC quarterly newsletter, as well as bi-weekly AFCAC highlights, where we report not only on the meetings that are happening or events or conferences, but also on the tangible liberalization actions on new route openings linked to the SAATM decisions and progress in related areas such as taxes, charges, and facilitation. And as we advance, John, my ambition is to move from really the narrative reporting to a more intuitive scorecard, that public scorecard, or a barometer, if you like. So a SAATM barometer that is regularly updated. And the building blocks are already in place in these audits, as mentioned, in our monitoring of the concrete measures, in our monitoring of the routes that are being developed, in our monitoring of the resolution of non-physical barriers, in our monitoring of positive actions and success stories from our member states. So what we're working on now is to digitize that information so that stakeholders can see at a glance which states have fully liberalized third, fourth, and fifth freedom rights, which routes are being, the new routes that are being operational, which have adopted these competition and consumer frameworks, and where the outstanding restrictions remain. And the level of transparency, I think, will reinforce peer pressure as well, rewarding the leading states and airlines in terms of incentivizing them towards further action and give investors and airlines a clearer basis for planning.
Yeah, I think all of this is really interesting because I think there is a perception that either you have an open market or a closed market. And the truth is you're on the journey from one to the other. And therefore it needs to be communicated. And people are like, when are we going to see this? And it's like, well, no, it's a journey. That's what you're obviously communicating today. And I think an idea of a scorecard, like I like barometer as well, but the whole purpose here is it's not to embarrass anybody. It's completely objective. You're either in, you're compliant, or you're not. And we're just showing based on the objective measures whether your country is or not. And we're very much here to support that communication, especially the visual stuff, you know, so obviously we'll be here to push that out and all the great work that the team are doing there. So let's come back to the fifth freedom side of things, because we've talked about why this is so important, and this is the key to unlocking more connectivity. And of course you need the adoption of the fifth freedom rights. And we're seeing a lot of movement in this area. as you mentioned, some of the routes already. But from an airline's perspective, if there is an airline carrier that is denied Fifth Freedom access in a state that is SAATM operational, what is that process when it comes to escalating this to AFCAC? How do you intervene, and what power do you have if a state fails to honour its obligation through SAATM?
Yeah, so as mentioned before, we believe firmly and we actually know that the Fifth Freedom routes are amongst the most powerful tools we have to unlock connectivity in Africa, especially on those long thin markets where no single city pair can sustain a direct service. Okay, so when a state has signed up to SAATM, but an airline is denied Fifth Freedom rights without legitimate safety or security grounds, then there is a clear path to escalation. From the state's perspective, let's talk about this now. We get, and just to give practical examples of what has happened over the past 3 years, we get calls, I get called by states, and they say, listen, we are trying to get into market X, and we're not getting through, or we're getting this restriction or whatever, or I get written a letter and so on and so forth. Excuse me. In fact, on our SAATM PIP roadshows, we actually received from AFRA a list of the requests by airlines to certain states and where they were having challenges. And we were able to resolve over this period about 13 of these just through mediation, just through engaging with the two states to say, how about opening up to each other? This has come to our attention. Can you address this? And that has worked very well. But we cannot always use that mechanism. There needs to be something concrete that airlines need to know. So from the airline's perspective, I think the first step is to document the case, right? So write formally to AFCAC to say, this is the challenge that we're having in market X. And that means providing us with the relevant air service agreement or MOU that they have in that state, the designation and authorization correspondence that they've requested from that state, the reasons that are given for denial or delay, and any related conditions or documentation that appear discriminatory or inconsistent with the YD and YD provisions. So once we receive that dossier, if you like, our technical and legal teams assess it against the YD and the SAATM audit measures and the applicable bilateral framework. Then we can take the appropriate remedial action. And in many cases, issues can be resolved just like that, through that direct engagement, as I've mentioned. We write to the states concerned, we set out our legal and policy assessment of the situation, and invite the authorities to a consultation, often virtually, to clarify the basis of the decision. Quite a few disputes, as I've mentioned, have been settled like that and at that stage, with the states withdrawing the restrictions or granting the requested rights once the implications are clearly explained. However, if the issue persists, the matter can be referred now to the dispute settlement mechanism. And this is one of the elements of the SAATM that stakeholders said were not in place a few years ago. It is now in place, and not just as a secretariat, but also with an administrative council made up of lawyers and arbitrators from across African countries that have been properly established and set up. This mechanism is designed to receive any complaints or concerns or issues from any of the stakeholders that operate the market, meaning from a state, from an airline, from an airport, or even other stakeholders. These can bring a complaint or an issue to the mechanism. And it is now operational with this administrative council appointed, as I mentioned. What we need to do as part of what we will do as part of our communications campaign is to make this great awareness around the existence of not just the secretariat, even though we've been talking about it, but we need to then create awareness so that there is a page or a link on the AFCAC website that takes you to the dispute settlement mechanism site and to either lodge a complaint or to raise a concern or to make an issue. So airlines can work through their states, or states can bring cases directly. And the DSM process allows for an independent assessment and ultimately a decision that clarifies the parties' obligations. That decision then becomes a reference point for future cases. So we're starting to build some kind of precedence within the market, which is critical to building as well predictability on how the market operates and also how fifth freedom rights are treated across the continent. And also engagement directly with our airlines. We have some airlines who are really, really good at curating some of the issues that they're having in terms of where SAATM works, where SAATM is not working so well, where SAATM is not working at all. And this helps us as well, in terms of that information compendium, if you like, of assessing what the issues are, the practical issues are that the airlines face on the ground.
Yeah, I think ultimately where we want to get to is that there are no complaints coming through because everybody's complying with the rules that they've agreed to, right? But I think having the dispute settlement mechanism and having access to that is super important. So once that has gone through and the decision is made, is that legally binding, or is this just we found this and now we're hoping, please can you implement it? Like, I think that's the challenge, is how much can you enforce this, or and what are the repercussions for a state that then says, well, we understand your decision but we don't agree with it and we're not going to allow access. Like, what do you do then?
Exactly, a fundamental point. And here is the kicker. The YD is a binding legal treaty. Binding, all right? So it is a binding decision on the 44 states that have signed up to it out of the 54, okay? So that market is already 90% of Africa. So that's what we focus on. So that's the first issue. But in the implementation of the YD, we have seen this uneven approach and even resistance in some cases. So this is where the real issue lies. And I want to draw a parallel between our own African liberalization market and the European liberalization market, because here is where the difference is, the key difference. The AU framework for enforcement is totally different to that of Europe. There is a clear enforcement mechanism for the common rules of the European Union. And any of the states that do not abide by those common rules of the European Union have clear enforcement mechanisms in place through the European Court of Justice and other layers of enforcement. In Africa, under our own African Union, it's not the same thing. And so this is where the issue comes in, and that's why we've been using the different remedial actions that we can take to address some of these challenges. Now, enforcement is always the uncomfortable part of any liberalization story, but it is also what makes the rules meaningful. So we're aware of that. And the YD and the SAATM are not just aspirational. They actually do have some enforcement provisions within them. Also, including the DSM architecture that was built into the YD, because the dispute settlement mechanism is an annex of the YD. And they are designed to give these commitments some teeth. So at the first level, as we said, we start with dialogue, with remedial interventions, technical assistance, and with mediation as corrective tools. When we see non-compliance, we move into issuing recommendations, timelines, and where relevant, target support missions to help a state align with its laws or practices or regulations with the SAATM. Often, what we found is that the constraint is not necessarily political resistance, but either outdated regulations, either a lack of internal coordination, or simple capacity gaps. So addressing those, they are still part of the enforcement and remedial actions that we take, and just through more cooperative means rather than adversarial.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how, it just matters that it gets fixed. Exactly. You just want to find out where is the blockage, not, right, it's always this or it's always that. It could be something really administrative, is what you're saying. Absolutely. That is literally somebody didn't fill the right. Yeah, exactly. So you want to exhaust those avenues before it becomes.
This is not SAATM related per se, but it's also affiliated. Do you remember the case of the Cape Town trip, where I was kept aside because I had an e-visa?
Oh, yes, very well.
The last man on the line, when the immigration officer did not know that the e-visa was the new rule. So these are some of the issues that we face. And many times you find that it's simply, as you said, an administrative blockage. So now, but where there's persistent or deliberate non-compliance, then the dispute settlement mechanism should come into play. And the Secretariat can receive complaints, as mentioned. The Administrative Council can hear the case, and the outcome will be a formal decision that interprets the obligations of the parties in light of SAATM. Now, this is yet to be tested. So we need to have a case, I guess. But we're not necessarily calling for an adversarial situation, but we need to go through these motions because we recently set up the Administrative Council and so on and so forth. But as we get these complaints, the council can then move and can then work and we start to see what actually happens in these cases.
Yeah, it's good. It's good to know that there's an arbitrator, right? That's the thing. The airlines feel there's a third party who's there to hear both sides, and like a informal, or a formal kind of courtroom. And this obviously talks to your experience as a lawyer as well.
And I was just about to say that even in law, in litigation, or in arbitration, there are different steps. Okay, so a judgment is, first of all, the case is heard. And then both sides are given a chance to speak to the, documentation is considered. And then following that, a judgment is given. Now that judgment is binding. Following that also is the enforcement of that judgment, right? And there are different ways to enforce, so even in the law, there are different ways of enforcement. You first believe that somebody will adhere to a judgment in good faith. That is the first thing, even in a litigation. And then if they don't, you go into a different kind of enforcement mechanism that you can implement in that case. And they can recommend, the dispute settlement mechanism can recommend corrective actions, including removing discriminatory conditions, granting withheld rights, or amending regulatory provisions. And like I said, through our own mediation efforts, we've had different kinds of cases actually come to us, which we've been able to address these issues. Now, in the background, there's also the political layer. So AFCAC reports systematically to the AU. We start first with the AU's own, different layers of reporting. We have the Specialized Technical Committee on Transport. So these are the ministers of transport and aviation of Africa. And then from there, we make all the recommendations, the issues, they consider all the things they need to do. They make decisions on things that we take to them. And then they pass this on to the heads of state. And then the Assembly of Heads of State endorse whatever we have taken to them. And we have several examples of this in safety, in security, on SAATM. I mean, SAATM is already a head of state decision anyway. And so we're taking the approach of sustained political focus, not political will. I hear about this, there's no political will for SAATM. No, there is actually. It is sustained political focus on SAATM implementation. That is the key. So we have all our different layers as well. Presidential layer, ministerial layer, the directors general, airlines, and so on and so forth. And working even with the experts who are in charge, the technical teams who are working on all of these issues. So persistent non-compliance can actually attract political scrutiny and peer pressure from the ministerial or heads of state level as well. And over time, our public reporting and scorecard that will become, that will start and become more visible. And also there will be a reputational aspect to this because it will then create incentives with that kind of pressure that will reinforce the legal issues. And I think, finally, that we start with, the approach is starting with engagement and support and communication, but we don't shy away as well from using, what means are available under the YD structures and the toolbox when needed. Because as we said, this is a market and the market needs to function under those rules of engagement.
Yeah, I think really comprehensive. I think political will, absolutely. That is a subjective thing that nobody can measure. Much better that you measure the progress and actually the actions rather than what's being said. So I completely agree with that. And reputation as well. I think that knowing that you've been down this road, it also impacts AFCAC's reputation. Say, hey, look, it has got teeth because it's responded, it's been involved, and it's been able to any sort of legal action between an airline and a state or whatever. You just don't want to get it to that level. So I think that's very clear. And I think that ultimately, the engagement with governments is super critical, but there is a bit of a perception from some of the carriers that I speak to that are privately owned that the state-owned or legacy carriers do receive some more attention. So how do you ensure that the smaller, the newer, the privately owned African airlines feel supported and are able to compete fairly? And is that a fair comment, or are you saying that isn't what we're hearing?
Yeah, John, it's a fair comment. It's a fair concern that, and I think in this market, the most visible beneficiaries at first tend to be the larger, or in some cases, state-backed carriers. This is a fact in any liberalization market. Now, from AFCAC's standpoint, SAATM was never designed for a handful of flag carriers or carriers. It was intended for a genuinely competitive African market where both state and privately owned airlines, hybrid, niche operators can also thrive. So we should approach this in three ways. The first is, again, the rules of engagement. So the regulatory fairness and the model economic regulation that we've developed jointly with states and which is also receiving scrutiny from the airline associations is, and the competition templates we have developed, they are explicitly geared towards preventing the abuse of dominant position, predatory pricing, and discriminatory access to essential services like slots, ground handling, and airport infrastructure. Now, that is one aspect of things, but there's the other aspect, which is the protectionism aspect, where, airlines actually prevent states from proceeding with implementation of SAATM, either it's the granting of fifth freedom or through restrictions of capacity or frequency and so on and so forth to protect their own market. Now, here's what the issue is. It's a market. So in a market, for those who go to the market, most Africans, I think, at some point have been to a market. And if you go to a market, on the same line, you have tomato sellers. They are selling tomatoes. They are next to each other selling tomatoes. So what does that mean then? Why not say, oh, sorry, I'm the only one who can sell tomatoes here and nobody else can sell tomatoes? Well, the issue is about what is the service that you're offering. That is what a market is all about. You go to a textile market, it's the same thing. Everybody is selling textiles. We are walking through an airport. Togo is a fantastic example, Lome Airport. You have all of those ladies and men who are selling the textiles, and they're right there side by side. It is a market. Offer the best service rather than try to limit entry into that market and to restrict access, because nobody grows that way. The market does not thrive that way. The reason why you have the same line of tomato sellers is because everybody has an equal chance of getting a piece of the pie. And that's how the market is supposed to be. So in terms of that aspect, it's also important. And that's where we come in to engage with those states to say, and to create awareness around the detrimental effect of protectionism on the market. Okay, so when we work with the states to domesticate these frameworks as well, we are very clear that this liberalized market must also be a contestable market, right? Where new entrants have a fair shot and where different models of airlines, have a fair chance as well. All right. And of course, everything is subject to keeping an eye on safety and security. The second approach is targeted capacity building and creating visible awareness around this. In our workshops and connectivity development events, we deliberately invite smaller and newer African airlines, sometimes providing support, financial support through our partners to help them participate. We are working with AFRA, as I mentioned, with ASA, with IATA, and even others to ensure that their concerns are heard in discussions, for example, on taxes and charges, on access to market, on licensing and designation issues, on facilitation measures like visas and border processes, and access to distribution and settlement systems. So programs like IATA's Focus Africa, which we participate in, also explicitly recognize the importance of strengthening the broader ecosystem, not just individual large carriers. Programs like yours as well, John, we know tries to bring together the ecosystem, and that's also a very, very welcome development. So part of the strategy, if you recall in our last podcast, was that we would be engaging with all the different relevant stakeholders. We engage with ACI, we engage with Kanzo, just in addition to all those we have mentioned, to see how we can continue to create awareness at these events and to engage with the different stakeholders that we do meet at these events. And then the third is to address the structural barriers, right, that disproportionately could harm or impede the smaller airlines. The main issue is high and unpredictable charges, fees, levies, taxes. And then the slow or opaque approval processes, the limited access to affordable funding or financing and leasing options, and training and licensing bottlenecks. They can be existential for an emerging carrier. And our work on harmonizing taxes and charges, on streamlining the market access procedures through SAATM, and on establishing pools of regional experts for oversight and training, as well as working with our development partners on these potential African leasing or financing platforms for the airlines, part of the work in progress. This is also partly about de-risking the environment for the different players. And so when speaking with governments, I emphasize that supporting SAATM is also an SME and innovation policy, because I know that these are big, not just buzzwords, but a lot of political attention is in these areas. And many of the most interesting business models we see today in Africa, from thin route connectors to specialized cargo operators, and even virtual interline platforms, and even the drone operators, they come from the newer or privately owned airlines. And our job at AFCAC is to make sure that the rules and the environment do not lock them out.
Yeah, really comprehensive. I think ultimately, I love what you said about the competition and the tomato sellers and everything else. And at the end of the day, it's about growing the pie, right? And understanding that I don't have to lose for you to win. We can both win by stimulating a whole new market. And I always talk about what EasyJet and Ryanair did in terms of the low-cost revolution. They didn't necessarily destroy overnight British Airways and Air France's business. What they did is they created the ability for people of a layer who never thought they would fly, they suddenly could afford to fly, and they brought in these high density, low cost aircraft. And I think it's the same principle. It's this whole spirit of competition. Number one, I get better. And number two, we can both be successful so long as we're not, stepping on each other's toes too much. So we're going to close, but I have one final question. Of course, we have to look forward. And I did this in the previous episode, which again, you can go and have a listen to. But your KPIs for your term ahead, because of course you run this term until the end of August 2028, I believe, is your 3-year term sort of.
Yes.
Expiry. So if we had to narrow it down to sort of 3 KPIs that you're going to personally use, that we can say, this is how we're going to measure your success as SG over that 3-year term, what would they be?
Okay. So if I had to choose only 3 KPIs between now and the end of August, I would group them around sort of 3 pillars. The first is connectivity, the second is compliance, and the third is cost. Put another way, you could call connectivity accessibility, you could call cost affordability, and compliance sustainability, all right? But let's look at these 3 buckets. So the first KPI of connectivity, let's look at it this way. The share of intra-African traffic and the depth of our route network is what we need to look at, and how we're seeing that moving up. Okay, so the measure is not that we have hit a particular number necessarily, but is that we're seeing an upward trend. Because what that means then is that the market is moving. So that is really what we need to see, and that connectivity is factually increasing across our continent. And as we said, in 3 years, we've been able to say we have 113 new routes. So in the next 3 years, we want to be able to measure that again and say, this is the additional number of routes that we're seeing operating. And these are some of the other dimensions that we're measuring and seeing progress in those areas. So concretely, I'd like to see the intra-African share of our traffic moving decisively upward. As I mentioned, from the low 20s, we've actually set ourselves a target of 30% by 2027. So let's see how we do by the August 2028. And also to be able to point to at least an additional maybe 100 new intra-African routes, saying that with all my fingers and toes crossed.
Me too.
And with a healthy share involving fifth freedom or multi-stop operations because of the necessity of those routes. And we should also be tracking how states can classify as fully SAATM operational based on what we talked about in these KPIs and audits we're doing, and with all the identified gaps closed. Now, in the second KPI on compliance, this focuses, of course, on the core of aviation, the core business, safety and security performance. Without these, we cannot thrive as an aviation market. So here I'm looking at the average effective implementation score as per ICAO, but also how the airlines are doing on safety. So there are two performance metrics that we need to look at, the state side and the airline side. On the state side, we have the ICAO USOAC audit, and on the airline side, we have the IATA or EASA audits. So how are our African airlines doing on this area? For security, we also have the ICAO USOP audit. For security, we audits the state security measure. And I guess under the IOSA, security is also part of that audit. So we need to look at these properly over the next 3 years and really track how our airlines are doing. We hear a lot that Africa has the worst safety record in the world. I find it interesting, right? Because based on the traffic, the percentage of traffic compared to other regions of the world, you can't be comparing apples to apples. It's just not possible. And so with 2%, and if you have X number of flights with an accident, compared to 20% and the same number, it's not the same. But of course, nobody wants accidents. Nobody. So we are keeping an eye, like I mentioned. This is something that we're really radical about, that to make sure that we're really supporting our states in keeping these numbers to the minimum so that we can really be reporting zero accidents. There have been years over the past 10 that Africa has recorded zero accidents, but we need to make sure that we are monitoring this very closely. Alongside, we will check how the states have domesticated the SAATM competition and consumer protection frameworks and some of the other regulations and fully align their bilateral agreements, not just the policies, with the decision. So, because these are the foundations of a credible market. And the last KPI, the third, is cost and facilitation. So by 2028, I would like us to be able to demonstrate a measurable reduction in the tax, fees, and levy burden on intra-African tickets in key corridors, particularly where regional decisions like the ECOWAS one of reduction of 25% are implemented, and also to show a significant increase in the number of states that have modernized their facilitation environment through e-visas, API, PNR, and one-stop security and more innovative border processes. Taken together, these factors directly affect the affordability and attractiveness of air travel for intra-African citizens and businesses. Now, there's two more things I want to talk about. On the environment side, Africa is, basically feels the effect of climate change very, very strongly, and we know that. But Africa has also decided to take responsibility for its own portion of aviation emissions. Now, what that also leads to is a great opportunity for Africa to participate in the energy transition towards net zero by 2050. And we'd like to see a few of our African states well and truly on the journey towards product development and deployment of some sustainable aviation or low carbon aviation fuels in the future. The final thing, I can't end this without talking about capacity and our people. Everything else, everything we've talked about today, John, speaks to our people. It's all about the people. So the people implement. The people implement rules, procedures, policies, whatever you name it, and even use the tools. So we have to ensure that we build as much capacity within Africa for African professionals. And if we take these two figures, with Africa having an average age of 19, but African aviation having an average age of 59, what are we going to do with the gap in the middle? So we've got to make sure that we are definitely ramping up capacity and skills. And one of our key initiatives is the AWAYA, which is the African Women and Youth in Aviation Framework that we launched in 2023, and we've been, doing quite a bit on so far. And we have to do so much more on this. I'd like to see more young people in aviation. I'd like to see more women, not just in aviation, but in, going into middle and senior management in aviation agencies and organizations, and doing a lot more. Africa already is the region that has the highest number of directors general in the world who are women, and also the highest number of CEOs in aviation agencies in the world. So we'd like to see more of that, trickling across the continent. And there's a lot of work to be done over the next 3 years on that. Thank you, John.
Yeah, I mean, Awaya is amazing. Based on what you said there, it doesn't sound like you're going to be very busy over the next 3 years.
I know.
Incredible. But what a vision. And there is, there is so much to do, but it's great to hear that we are making progress. So thank you so much for the support that you've shown us and me personally, and also being so generous today with your time and being so open to answer the sort of direct questions. I'm hoping our listeners feel that, I'm asking the questions that they're asking me, or that I'm picking up through other interactions. And you've been really open to engaging in that. And of course, this weekend at AFRA, hopefully people will have had chance to listen to this before they get there, and
exactly.
we can build on that afterwards as well. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you very much, John. It's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to engage with you, but also to share on the progress of work and tangible initiatives that we're taking in Africa. Thank you.
Wonderful. And we are going to obviously keep this conversation going and support each other with our communication. And you're seeing those results. We're hearing about these new routes on a regular basis. So if you did enjoy watching or listening to the episode, don't forget to hit share with wherever you're listening. Share it with somebody in your network you think would benefit from having a listen. Don't forget to subscribe, to like, so we can be found by more and more people. And we will be back for the next episode very soon. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great day. Bye-bye.